Story 1. The Highway of Shadows. Dusk had just fallen, and Jack drove his old car down the long, winding highway connecting two cities in the western United States. He had just finished an exhausting business trip and only wanted to get home before midnight. The road was eerily empty, with only his headlights piercing the darkness, illuminating the monotonous white lines on the pavement. The wind howled outside, causing the trees along the roadside to sway like skeletal hands reaching out to grab him. Jack turned on the radio to dispel the chilling silence, but all he heard was a strange static noise. Annoyed, he turned it off. His eyelids grew heavier with each passing mile, but every time he started to doze off, he felt as if something brushed past the outside of his car window. About 10 minutes later, in the glow of his headlights, Jack saw a man standing by the side of the road, his hand raised to hitchhike. The man was thin, wearing a long black raincoat and a hat that obscured his face. Jack hesitated for a moment before deciding to pull over. On an empty highway like this, how could I leave someone stranded? He thought. The man climbed into the car without a word, offering only a brief thank you in a low voice. Jack felt a wave of unease as the man sat silently in the back seat instead of taking the front. The air inside the car grew heavy with an inexplicable tension. "Where are you headed?" Jack asked, trying to break the silence. "Just farther ahead," the man replied, his voice gravelly, almost a whisper. Jack felt uncomfortable but chose not to press further. He focused on driving, though he couldn't shake the feeling that the man's eyes were fixed on his back, sending chills down his spine. After about 20 minutes, Jack glanced at the rearview mirror and noticed something bizarre. The man had no reflection. His heart raced, and beads of sweat formed on his forehead. He tried convincing himself it was a trick of the light, but when he looked again, the seat behind him appeared empty in the mirror. Yet, out of the corner of his eye, he could still see the man sitting there. Who are you?" Jack stammered, his voice trembling. The man remained silent for a moment before replying slowly, "I'm just a wanderer." Jack felt an ominous weight in those words. Suddenly, the headlights flickered and went out for a few seconds, plunging the car into complete darkness. When they came back on, Jack was met with a horrifying sight. The man was no longer in the back seat. Instead, he was standing on the roadside ahead, staring directly at the car with hollow, vacant eyes. Panic-stricken, Jack slammed on the brakes so hard that the car skidded along the pavement. He whipped around to check the back seat. Empty. Looking back to the road, the man had vanished. Breathing heavily, Jack tried to calm himself, but as he prepared to drive again, a chilling voice echoed from the back seat. "You think you can leave me behind?" Jack spun around, his body frozen in fear. The man was sitting right there, his face pale as death, his eyes like endless black voids. Suddenly, the entire car began to shake violently, as if some unseen force was trying to tear it apart. A harsh, raspy laughter filled the confined space, making Jack feel like he was descending into madness. With no other choice, Jack floored the gas pedal, driving wildly down the seemingly endless road. But the highway stretched on forever, the scenery on either side repeating itself like a cruel loop. The man's shadowy presence remained in the car, unmoving yet oppressive. Finally, Jack couldn't take it anymore. He screamed, "What do you want?" The man leaned close to his ear and whispered a sentence Jack would never forget. "This is my road, and you've entered a place not meant for the living." At that moment, Jack felt his entire body being yanked out of the car. He fell into a bottomless abyss, the sound of wind howling and sinister laughter echoing all around him. The next morning, police found Jack's car abandoned on the roadside, the door wide open. There was no sign of him anywhere. On the back seat, they discovered a soaking wet black raincoat and a message scrawled on the windshield. "This road is not for those who turn back." But the story didn't end there. A week later, locals near the highway began reporting strange occurrences. Late at night, phantom headlights would appear, cutting through the darkness before vanishing without a trace. Drivers who dared to travel that stretch of road spoke of a figure standing by the roadside, his hand raised for a ride, wearing a drenched black raincoat. Those who passed him claimed to hear a voice in their heads, whispering, "This road is not for those who turn back." Story 2. The Shadow on the Highway. The highway stretched on for miles, cutting through the barren landscape like a lifeline to nowhere. It was a desolate stretch, infamous among truckers and late-night travelers for its eerie solitude. Some said it was cursed. Others dismissed the stories as drunken ramblings. But one thing everyone agreed on was this: strange things happened on Route 60's forgotten stretch, especially when the moon was hidden behind clouds. Rachel gripped the steering wheel of her sedan tightly as she sped down the road. The clock on her dashboard blinked 2:47 a.m. in faint green light. She had taken the highway to save time on her drive back from visiting her parents. But now she was starting to regret it. The road was empty. The only sound was the hum of her engine and the occasional rush of wind rattling against the windows. Every so often, her headlights would catch the faint outlines of dilapidated road signs or abandoned rest stops. It was as though the world had forgotten this place existed. She turned up the volume on the radio to keep herself awake, but all she got was static. Annoyed, she switched it off and let out a sigh. Her phone was useless too, with no signal for the past hour. She tried to shake off the creeping unease that had been building in her chest since she entered this stretch of highway. It was just a road, she told herself. Roads can't be haunted. As she rounded a long curve, something caught her attention on the side of the road. A figure. It was just standing there, barely illuminated by her headlights. It looked like a man, tall and thin, draped in something dark that seemed to move with the wind, or against it. Rachel slowed down, her heart pounding. Who would be out here at this hour? When her car got closer, the figure stepped forward, right into the middle of the road. Rachel slammed on the brakes, her tires screeching as the car came to a halt just feet away from the shadowy figure. The headlights bathed it in light, but somehow it didn't illuminate anything. The figure remained shrouded in darkness, as if it absorbed the light rather than reflected it. There were no discernible features, no face, no eyes, nothing. Just a humanoid shape made entirely of shadow. Rachel's hands trembled as she fumbled for the gear shift, ready to reverse. Before she could, the shadow moved. It didn't walk or run. It glided toward her car, smooth and silent like smoke. Her breath caught in her throat as it passed through the hood of her car and disappeared. For a moment, everything was silent. Then her radio crackled to life, blasting a burst of static so loud it made her jump. Amid the static, she thought she heard a voice, faint but chilling. "You've seen me now. You can't leave." Panic surged through her as she slammed the car into reverse and backed away from where the figure had stood. Her tires spun on the loose gravel before catching traction. She turned the wheel sharply and accelerated, her eyes darting to the rearview mirror. The shadow was there, following her but not running. It just glided along the road, gaining on her despite the speedometer climbing past 70 miles per hour. "No, no, no!" Rachel screamed, her voice cracking. She floored the gas pedal, but the shadow didn't waver. It seemed to grow larger, its shape shifting and stretching until it loomed over the entire width of the road. Her headlights dimmed as though the shadow was consuming the light itself. Then the car sputtered. The engine coughed and groaned before dying completely. Rachel's heart sank as the dashboard lights flickered and went out. She was plunged into total darkness. Rachel grabbed her phone, desperate to call for help, but the screen remained black, unresponsive. The air inside the car grew thick, heavy, as if the shadow was seeping through the vents. She could feel it, a cold, oppressive presence pressing against her chest, making it hard to breathe. She screamed again, but her voice seemed swallowed by the darkness. The shadow began to take shape inside the car. It loomed in the passenger seat, inches away from her, a formless void radiating malice. And then, for the first time, it spoke, its voice low and guttural. "You shouldn't have come here." Rachel's mind raced, but her body was frozen in terror. She couldn't move, couldn't look away as the shadow stretched toward her, cold tendrils of darkness brushing against her skin. Just as she felt herself slipping into unconsciousness, a blinding light filled the car. Headlights. A truck roared past, its horn blaring as the driver barely missed her stationary car. The shadow recoiled, dissolving into the darkness outside. Rachel gasped for air as the oppressive weight lifted. She scrambled to restart her car, and to her relief, the engine sputtered back to life. She didn't wait to think. She slammed on the gas and sped away, her hands shaking uncontrollably. For the rest of the drive, she kept glancing in her mirrors, half expecting the shadow to reappear. But it didn't. When she finally reached the safety of her apartment, she locked every door and window and stayed awake until dawn, too scared to close her eyes. Weeks passed, but Rachel couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching her. Every time she drove at night, she avoided Route 66, no matter how much longer the detour took. But the shadow stayed with her, haunting her dreams, lurking in the corners of her vision. Sometimes, when the lights were low and the night was quiet, she could hear it whisper, "You can't leave." Months later, Rachel's paranoia reached its peak. She moved to a different state, leaving her car behind and taking public transportation instead. But even that wasn't enough. One night, while riding a late-night bus, she glanced out the window and froze. Standing by the roadside, bathed in the dim orange glow of a street lamp, was the shadow. It didn't move, didn't chase the bus. It just stood there watching. But Rachel knew. It was waiting. Story 3. The grave beside the highway. It was the kind of highway that seemed endless, stretching through the empty plains like a scar across the earth. Travelers avoided it if they could, citing a nameless dread that came from driving through miles of desolation. But for Sam, a long-haul truck driver who had seen every road in the state, this stretch of highway was just another job, or so he thought. The clock on his dashboard read 1:15 a.m. Sam yawned, his eyelids growing heavy as the hum of his truck engine droned on. He had been driving for hours without a break, and the isolation of the road was beginning to gnaw at him. The only light came from his high beams, illuminating the cracked asphalt and the occasional mile marker. As he rounded a bend, something unusual caught his eye. A small wooden sign stood on the side of the road, tilted slightly as if it had been placed in haste. It read, "Do not stop. Keep driving." Sam frowned, slowing his truck slightly as he passed the sign. It looked old, the letters faded and cracked, but the warning was clear. He shook his head and muttered, "Probably some kids messing around." But then he saw it. A few hundred yards ahead, bathed in the glow of his headlights, was a small grave. It was marked by a crude wooden cross, the kind you'd expect to see in an old Western movie. Beside the grave was a mound of dirt, as though the burial had been recent. Sam's stomach tightened. What was a grave doing out here in the middle of nowhere? As he approached, an uneasy feeling settled over him. The truck's headlights cast long, flickering shadows over the grave, making it seem as though the earth itself was moving. Against his better judgment, Sam slowed the truck to a crawl and eventually brought it to a stop. The air outside was unnaturally still as he stepped out of the cab. A chill ran down his spine, though the night was warm. The grave was closer now, just a few feet away. The wooden cross was crudely carved, the letters of a name etched into the surface. Elias Carter, 1897. Sam's brow furrowed. That didn't make sense. This highway hadn't even existed back then. He stepped closer, the dry dirt crunching under his boots. A faint smell of decay lingered in the air, though there were no animals in sight. Then he noticed the second sign. It was smaller, almost hidden among the weeds, and read, "Don't disturb him." A shiver ran down Sam's spine. He glanced around, half expecting someone to jump out of the darkness. But the road was empty, stretching endlessly in both directions. The only sound was the faint whistle of the wind. Sam turned back to the grave and felt a sudden, irrational urge to leave. But before he could move, something caught his attention. The dirt on the grave's surface was shifting. At first, he thought it was a trick of the light, but then he saw it again. The unmistakable movement of soil being displaced, as though something underneath was pushing its way out. Panic gripped him. He stumbled backward, his eyes fixed on the grave as the mound of dirt began to collapse inward. A skeletal hand broke through the surface, clawing at the air. Sam's breath hitched as the rest of the figure emerged, pulling itself up with an unnatural, jerky motion. It was a corpse, but not just any corpse. The flesh was leathery and stretched tight over its bones, the empty eye sockets glowing faintly with an eerie green light. The figure turned its head towards Sam, and though it had no lips, its jaw moved as if to speak. A hollow, rasping voice echoed through the stillness. "You shouldn't have stopped." Sam didn't wait to hear more. He bolted back to his truck, his heart pounding so hard it felt like it would burst. He fumbled with the door handle, cursing under his breath, and finally managed to climb inside. Slamming the door shut, he threw the truck into gear and hit the gas. The tires screeched as he sped down the highway, his eyes darting to the rearview mirror. The figure was standing in the middle of the road, its glowing eyes fixed on him. But as he drove farther, it didn't fade away. Instead, it seemed to grow larger, as though it was chasing him, consuming the space between them. The radio crackled to life, blasting static before a voice broke through. It was faint, but unmistakable. "You can't outrun me." Sam's hands shook as he gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white. He pressed the accelerator to the floor, the truck roaring as it tore down the desolate highway. The glowing eyes in the mirror were gone, but the dread remained, thick and suffocating. Hours later, as the first rays of dawn broke over the horizon, Sam pulled into a truck stop. His body was drenched in sweat, and his hands trembled as he turned off the engine. He sat there for a long time, staring at his reflection in the windshield, trying to convince himself it had all been a hallucination. But when he stepped out of the truck, he froze. There, on the dusty hood, was a single handprint. It was skeletal, the size of a man's hand, and it glowed faintly in the early morning light. Sam never took that highway again, but the stories persisted. Truckers passing through late at night would speak of a grave by the roadside, and of a shadowy figure that seemed to follow them long after they'd left it behind. Some claimed they could hear whispers on the wind, a single warning repeated over and over, "Don't disturb him." One driver swore he saw a figure standing at the grave one moonless night, its head bowed as if in mourning. When he slowed down to get a better look, the figure turned toward him, its glowing eyes piercing the darkness. He didn't stop. No one ever stops anymore. But every so often, when the conditions are just right, a lone traveler might see a grave bathed in the glow of their headlights. And if they're unlucky enough to stop, they might hear the faint sound of dirt shifting and a voice that will haunt them forever. You shouldn't have stopped.